The year 2020 has been exemplary for those that believe obedience is a high virtue. The go along to get along sentiment that began as a seemingly innocent response to an unknown viral enemy in late winter began to take on a new tone by early spring. 2 weeks to flatten the curve in order to give hospitals a chance to organize for what was projected to be an overwhelming number of patients turned into something more permanent. Unprecedented lockdowns, heated by the urgent warnings and pressure from China, were mimicked first in Italy and then spread, like a plague, to the rest of the Western world. These draconian measures usurped the global population, as we were told that this was for the greater good, and the only way to end the restrictions was to obey the contradiction, to adhere to them at all costs, without exception. Men of all ages and occupations, educations and backgrounds were recruited into the experiment. Men in white coats stepped onto the podium, former strangers who did not bother to introduce themselves, but instead began by telling us to be comforted by their presence. We assumed they were the experts. We were soon divided into two groups, the teachers and the learners.
We wanted to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation.
The teachers were given clear instructions by the whitecoats as to what they needed to do next, but not before they were given a small taste of the punishment that those on the other side would receive.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of volts you receive in the sample shot.
They were introduced to a small dose of pain that would stimulate in them the seed of fear as to what could happen to them if they were to get it wrong. They dutifully followed the instructions of the whitecoats and began to adjust to the strange experiment. It was hard to tell the teachers apart from the learners at first, since they had no prior reasons not to get along. But gradually, something began to change. The teachers, like good pupils, adhered closely to the words of the whitecoats and looked to them reassuringly to keep doing what they were doing. They proudly played their part, conforming to the rules and regulations set by the whitecoats. They adapted to their new positions as educators to their counterparts and continued to point out, with ever-increasingly painful punishments, when the learners said the wrong things.
Time.
Let me out!
That guy's hollering in there. Continue, please. Go on.
The learners began to protest the injustice and the suffering. They wanted out of the experiment. They knew at this point that there was nothing normal about it. Things had gone too far. Some of the teachers wanted out too. They never wanted things to go this far, but they didn't know how to get out of the situation they were in.
I can't stand the pain! Let me out of
You can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man today. You hear him hollering? He's
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
Despite knowing that something didn't sit quite right with them, they still felt compelled to listen to instruction and carry on obeying in hopes that it would soon be over.
The experiment requires that you continue teaching.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I'd
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there.
They deceived themselves into abdicating responsibility to the ones handing down orders. They lost sight of their individual choices in life, instead mindlessly doing as they were told, becoming complicit in the whole affair.
He's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. Who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Wrong.
Becoming more emboldened with their unprecedented new reign of authority, and the consent of the majority, the whitecoats pushed on harder. They kept the narrative going, imposing harsher conditions on all involved in the experiment, and encouraged the teachers to punish the learners if they continued to get it wrong.
Answer his neck. 300 volts.
At this point, the atrocious results of this experiment were impossible to ignore. The learners began to protest more loudly, their suffering having become unbearable. They were fighting for their livelihoods, their freedom, their pulse. But the louder their cries, the more their counterparts turned a blind eye. At this point, they had given up all responsibility for the outcome of their involvement, becoming completely submissive to authority, as their fellow man's cries became inaudible to them.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green.
With the new normal affirmed by the consent of the majority, the whitecoats successfully created a cognitive dissonance so strong in the population that they could no longer clearly see the difference between right and wrong.
I don't get no answer, no noise. Something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White. 450 volts.
With a distorted sense of reality and loss of ownership over one's own identity, it was now easy to suggest that what was true yesterday was no longer allowed to be remembered today. With all of the old systems being replaced by the use of masks, social distancing, the new normal, bubbles, online classrooms, isolation and fear, snitching and social unrest, it would leave this traumatized control group reeling from something they did not sign up for. What was happening to society? What was wrong with these people? How did things completely and inexorably fall apart in such a short amount of time? Were the teachers evil? Were the learners deserving to be punished? Was there something wrong with either group? Or were they purposefully manipulated like puppets in order to play out a scenario that they were not psychologically prepared to handle?
Next one is short. Sentence, movie, spurt, time.
All right, excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may.
How do you feel, by the way?
I feel all right, but I don't like what's happened to that fellow in there. He's been howling, and we had to keep giving him shots. I didn't like that one bit. I mean, he wanted to get out, and he just kept going, kept throwing 450 volts. I didn't like that. He wouldn't even look at that gentleman.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said, it got to keep going. I told him it's time we stopped when we got up to 195, 210 volts.
Well, why didn't you just stop?
He wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop.
The momentum of 2020's psychological experiment, combined with what Carl Jung might have referred to as the collective unconscious shadow of contemporary society, bring to mind a quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, noble author of the Gulag Archipelago. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority.
Is it possible that a malevolent authority could exist, not only in the history books, but in the very present times? Is it possible that you might not know what was actually going on, that you might have the wool pulled over your eyes, and that perhaps the trust in higher authority you took for granted might be wielded as a weapon against you?
If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.